Hi, and welcome to this lecture called Forcing the Hand of Chance, a subjective look at the DIY occulture of the Temple of Psychic Youth, TOPY. I hope that you will enjoy it. The early 1980s was a genuinely unique time for underground Western culture. The punk movement, with its do-it-yourself or DIY ethos, had left the original late 1970s burst of politically reactive naivete and instead manifested record labels and distribution networks, not necessarily as ways of cashing in on the big media hoopla, but rather to secure manifestation and distribution of unique and very creative records, as well as related items such as fanzines, books, clothes, etc. And let's not forget the new music that these initial grassroots foundations spawned by simply giving creative people a chance to have their records out, for instance. It was an era of creativity, intense innovation, and of forcing quite a few old structures to crumble, at least temporarily. One of these labels was London-based Industrial Records, which was started by British artist Genesis P-Orridge and his collaborators in the radical avant-garde band Throbbing Gristle, or TG. Although very different in style from punk and post-punk expressions, the transgressive band and the label became quite successful, learning gradually to operate as any other bigger label. The visibility of something so out of the ordinary, style-wise and intellectually, with their industrial music, inspired many people to do something similar, both in terms of starting a band, or a project or a label. It was possible to be different. As Industrial Records and TG folded in 1981, the new P-Orridge project Psychick Television, or PTV, and the related magical group the Temple of Psychic Youth, TOPY, arose from the ashes. After a few initial releases on major labels such as Warner and CBS, PTV eventually organized their own label, aptly called Temple Records. Not only would this be a vehicle to sell PTV records, but to an equal degree, if not more, to spread information and ideas rooted in their brand new think tank or magical order. Psychic TV were originally presented as a video group, which also made music, although the proportions eventually changed in favor of the music. A similar fluidity existed between TOPY and PTV. TOPY was the center around which all other activities orbited or were rooted, not the band PTV. Other examples of labels with radical and more or less magical or philosophically inclined bands emanating more or less from this early 1980s core were Threshold House, House in Coil, United Dairies with Nurse with Wound, Dirt Row with David Tibet's Current 93, and even Susan Lawley with White House. Many of these have been written about in David Keenan's England's Hidden Reverse, a book which focuses mainly, but not exclusively, on the satellites of the Industrial Records, TG, TOPY, early PTV cabal or environment. And there are other interesting books about this era, for instance Simon Ford's Wreckers of Civilization, Lars Sundestrand's To Become Who You Are, Genesis and mine Sacred Intent, and of course Genesis's autobiography, which was published posthumously, Non-Binary. What's interesting in this entire scene is, again, the fluidity between esoteric content and a causal business based in DIY, usually lovingly called a cottage industry, and how they interact to not only sell records, but also to convey a message. Temple Records released a lot of records, many of which contained substantial information or references. Perhaps as a comment on this steady flow, at one point Genesis coined the term or slogan, "The process is the product, which of course logically works vice versa too. All the products and events drove the process, cross-fertilized, interbred, mutated, and documented the progress along the way. One good example of this was the Psychick TV LP called A Real Swedish Live Show, part of an ambitious live concert documentation series, and to which we'll return shortly. But first, let's rewind the cassette tape of history. The process is the product is also the title of a 2008 autobiographical essay by Genesis that is a very substantial rear-view mirror. And I quote, "What would happen if we created a paramilitary occult organization that shared demystified magical techniques? Sleeve notes could become manifestos, a call to action, and behavioral rebellion. Bit by bit, we took this daydream more seriously. We examined the process, in particular, for the best in cult aesthetics. We needed an ideology for those involved, levels to achieve, secrets to reveal, symbols and uniforms, regalia and internal writings. We called our experimental organization the Temple of Psychic Youth." End quote. The process being examined here refers to the Process Church of the Final Judgment, a British neo-Gnostic Scientology spin-off that wove in distinct occult symbols and imagery as a kind of flamboyant, magical, psychedelic bridge between the hippies and whatever was to come. They had a powerful presence through well-made publications and events, and a philosophy that tried to transcend opposites by union, not unlike another TOPY source of inspiration, Aleister Crowley and his magical system. At about the same time as the process flourished in London in the late 1960s, William Burroughs, also situated in London, wrapped up his novel called The Wild Boys. It was first published in 1969. This would turn out to be another important poetic piece of the puzzle. I quote from the 1992 Grove Press backside blurb, quote, "The Wild Boys is a futuristic tale of a global warfare in which a guerrilla gang of boys dedicated to freedom battles the organized armies of repressive police states." End quote. The blurb of the 1973 Corgi edition states, quote, "The year is 1988. Adolescent guerrilla packs of specialized humanoids are routing the forces of civilized nations and ravaging the earth. From their small beginnings in 1969 as petrol gangs, dousing their victims with petrol and setting them on fire for kicks, they have grown to an army dedicated to violence and death. When wholesale slaughter erupts, the battle continues underground, where the survivors evolve into the Wild Boys, hordes of pitiless homosexual warriors who move in and destroy the cities until civilization collapses, revealing a future of horrifying dimensions." End quote. The psychosexual paranoia of William Burroughs and other fantastical contemporary authors like J.G. Ballard, with its focus on how to destabilize the blind control mechanisms of societal authority, became a cornerstone in the TOPY outlook. Could these tendencies of enforced subjugation be bypassed or possibly even overcome? And if so, how? Straightforward politics was seemingly not the most constructive way in a repressive society like the UK of the 1970s and 80s. So this kind of drifting into a cultural sphere and its powerful allies, art and myth, seemed to make perfect sense. Then add some ultra-individualistic liberation by sexual magic and psychonautics under the umbrella of hardcore creative individuation. spice it up with some integration of past masters in a grassroots network, and there you have it, a kind of formula for resistance to mindless control and destruction that both gives meaning to one's own life and inspires others. I was attracted to the work and ideas of PTV and TOPY as I had already been a TG fan from the early 1980s and onwards. In my life there were parallel strains of the music and culture as such, and the intellectual and quite often philosophically inclined environments that were referenced in both the music and lyrics and the records themselves, in LP liner notes, booklets, adjoining fanzines, etc. One thing led to another, and then back again. A passionate interest in all things magical was awoken in me through these indulgences in curious references, and there were many great contemporary soundtracks available via cool record stores, even in my native Stockholm. In 1984 I started subscribing to information from TOPY. This consisted of bulletins, newsletters, mail order information and promotional material for both TOPY and PTV. They were a kind of inseparable corpus or being, filled with the signal of potential. PTV promoted TOPY and vice versa. And there was also more distinct propaganda and information about recommended magical techniques and literature. It was all highly inspiring for me, and I began experimenting with these magical techniques as presented in the key TOPY manual called the Grey Book. I found that the pragmatism and mix of zeitgeistish existentialism, Crowley's Thelema philosophy, Austin Spare's ecstatic hardcore magic, and the poetic life enhancement of the Beat authors worked very well indeed for me, and so I associated the inspiration and material itself with my own actual success in manifesting the things and changes I needed in my life at the time. It was all one wonderful synergetic resonance loop that created a strong imprint, and in many ways it still does. In 1986 I went to London and interviewed Genesis for my music fanzine Lollipop. And that was another very inspiring moment that led on to my becoming more active within TOPY. The interview had initially been focused on musical aspects, but soon the talks we had about magic took over. It was also highly interesting for me to see how it all functioned in real life, what kind of work actually lay behind the signal that was so inspiring to me. In their tiny semi-detached house in Hackney in London, the P-Orridge family and many psychic youth produced and sent out correspondence and information, attended to administrational chores, and just basically hung out and lived their day-to-day lives. And the people I met then were very friendly and as curious about me as I was about them. It was an enlightening glimpse into a loose collective in which everyone worked hard with whatever needed to be done. And there was a lot. There was also Temple Records, which released music by Psychick TV and many other artists, and Temple Press, which published relevant old minds like Crowley, MacLeish, Malanga, Cohen, as well as TOPY affiliated contemporaries like P-Orridge, Zev and Andrew Mackenzie. I realized that although the overarching fuel and goal was the beautiful term that Genesis coined and within which we are gathered here today, occulture, the main energy was simply hard work and, if you will, bhakti yoga, the power of devotion to a cause. That synced very well with my already existing and dominant workaholic tendencies. We developed some basic strategies together over the following years, to a great deal based on other local TOPY groups, or access points as they were called. And in 1988 I started TOPY Scandinavia, or TOPY Scan, perhaps as a subconscious wink of acknowledgement to the 1988 timeline of Burroughs' Wild Boys. At this time I already had insight into how TOPY actually worked, and I was also now an active TOPY member, in the sense that I was using the recommended sigillizing techniques regularly, becoming Eden 162, as sigillizing male members were given the names Eden, and sigillizing female members the name Kali. There were a few other TOPY members or sigillizers and subscribers in Sweden, and I knew about most of them. And from that small core, we expanded into being in correspondence and business also in Denmark, Finland, and Norway. And we did the whole TOPY thing. We produced writing, newsletters, music, videos, sold cassettes and other items for postage cash, started a record label, started the occultural fanzine, the Fenris Wolf, and made a point of actively networking, not only with headquarters in London, but also with other TOPY stations and access points all over the world. The Psychick TV LP I mentioned briefly before, a real Swedish live show, is a good example of the cross-fertilization. It's a documentation of Psychick TV's 1984 concert in Stockholm, which a friend of mine had recorded on cassette. TOPY Scan released the album in 1989 with youthful and symptomatically anti-Christian liner notes by me, I quote. "Pagan activities have never died, not anywhere, and today it's all coming back to you. A magical appreciation of history and life in the work for all people's common future. Theirs is a good definition of a free person, and that's one who is completely honest with her or himself in every situation, and who's thereby working for the procreation of womankind. The honesty becomes the medium, the work is the goal itself." End quote. The album was officially number 16 of Psychick TV's live documentation series, one album released on the 23rd of every month for 23 consecutive months, which actually led to a mention in the Guinness Book of World Records. And this wasn't only exciting, but also a way of financing our very local operations, as Genesis and Psychick TV had waived their royalties in favor of TOPY Scan's activities. Everything quickly grew, and we also used the momentum to organize lectures, concerts and film screenings, both in Sweden and abroad, including traveling in Europe with 16mm prints of Anthony Bolch's film collaborations with William Burroughs and Brian Geisen. When the TOPY Europe station, based in the Netherlands, folded, I took over, as I already had experience of how to run things. And sometimes it's true what they say: if you want something done, give it to someone who's already very busy. So now there were suddenly even more mailings and more administration to chew on. And parallel to this, I also started a company called Psychick Release to take everything to the next level. It was a publishing company as well as a record and video label, and we got off to a pretty good start. The first album that we released was the ambient spoken word collaboration between the P-Orridges and my band White Stains, called At Stockholm, which was released in 1990. Book-wise, we published Swedish and Norwegian translations of The Grey Book and ditto for Crowley's Book of the Law, plus facsimiles of the great Swedish scholar Sigurd Agrell's books on rune magic and Scandinavian esotericism, plus many, many other things. Lots of mail was sent, outgoing, incoming, and information needed was often quite quickly provided in the form of Xeroxes, cassettes, VHS videotapes from within the network. It was like being in a vortex of support and unlimited potential, in which most of the time everything was also fulfilled. But it wasn't all about producing material that needed to be sent out in some kind of mechanical networking creativity. We also worked locally on a ritual level and welcomed other TOPY members to visit, which they did. We had workshops with the Norwegian shaman Arthur Sørensen and percussive rhythmagic wizard Zev. And although the sigilizing was usually something done privately because of the sexual and intimate nature of the process, my girlfriend at the time, who was a TOPY Kali, and myself also experimented together with other TOPY people to ritualize for communal goals, for instance. Did it work, or was it just for kicks? I would say so, meaning yes to both questions. During 1990 to 1991, Genesis and Tom Banger, who ran the TOPY North America station, and myself each had some sort of overload breakdown. Almost in psychic sync, we got fed up with the increasing administration and having less and less time to fully indulge in the core activities, magic and creativity. In a letter dated May 23, 1991, Jen wrote to me, quote, "When we resigned from TOPY last October, I said to Alora I wanted to return to serious work and exploration, a truly transmedia activation, something which could be more inclusive and loose, allowing collaborators from all expressive systems and spiritual systems. I wanted to do more art, if you like, rather than be a resentful minor clerk for an illusion." End quote. A period of slight confusion followed after we had each made parallel decisions to detach ourselves, and then it was over. Or was it? Let's just say that the first phase of a full decade of this kind of communal work was over. Although there were people who saw some kind of imaginary baton and ran with it, and perhaps they still do. However, many key people from phase one kept working together on both similar and dissimilar projects throughout the decades. Genesis and I produced 2 more spoken word albums, made a documentary film, and worked on the book Sacred Intent together, which was published shortly before Jen's death in 2020. Other people from this first era of TOPY also bloomed into great artists in their own right. Current 93, Coil, People Like Us, and Cyclobe are just a few examples. Some individuals remained positive towards TOPY, some didn't. But I think it's safe to say that the initial inspiration and model for how to work within a magic steeped in art, and vice versa, came from having been active in TOPY at some point. And in my own case, it's still very vibrant and relevant. Working on the book Sacred Intent with Genesis, which is basically our recorded conversations between 1986 and 2019, brought back a lot of TOPY related thoughts and feelings in us both. We discussed what TOPY had meant for us, and quite often if any of it still had any relevance. We agreed it did, and new generations certainly seemed more interested than ever in what lies behind the symbol of the iconic psychic cross. There is currently an ambitious documentary about TOPY being finished called Message from the Temple, and I think that is exactly an example of this recent interest. I reconvened with Tom Banger in 2019 at a conference my wife and I organized in Italy, as he was giving a talk together with fellow TOPY member Koshka about TOPY North America campouts and rituals. It was highly interesting stuff that I vaguely remembered hearing about way back when, and could now get a fuller insight into. It seems that the decades have allowed for the activities and documentation to mature in the dark of various private archives and memories. Tom and Koshka's lecture has recently been published in issue number 11 of the Fenris Wolf, the journal that began in 1989 as a distinct TOPY fanzine. This was a very condensed version of my own experiences with TOPY, and there's a lot more to be said, and I will cover some of that in a magical autobiography of sorts, tentatively called 2 times Saturn, that will come out early 2024. But for now, let's delve into some of the mechanics and into the zeitgeist to see how TOPY could become as influential a group or order as it actually has. We can look at this zooming both back and forth. If we zoom back to some kind of bird's eye perspective, there are definite traces from the mail art movement that was, and perhaps still is, connected to a fluxus mentality, meaning that the definitions of art itself are dissolved and can be, as it's usually called today, fluid. Anything can be art, and on a real grassroots level, what we send to each other as memes or messages, digital or not, are works of art if interpreted as such. It is up to the artist and partaker to evaluate and define. Already in the pre-Throbbing Gristle performance group called Coom Transmissions, Genesis actively networked with other artists, curators, journalists, editors, etc., sending out massive amounts of letters, collages, stamped photographs, and many other things. Later on, with Industrial Records and Throbbing Gristle, it continued, also in tandem with records and concerts. And of course, this wasn't a one-way communication. An amazing amount of mail was sent to Genesis and the others involved, so that foundation of intense and vital communications had been established already before punk and DIY, so to speak. The creation of unique artworks, such as handwritten poems, collages, drawings, paintings, and photographs, was part of the process, something that created a special bond between sender and receiver. Sending something very personal off to somewhere you weren't really sure whether it would be received at all. But if it was, you would very likely get something very special in return. In this sense, mail art laid the foundation not only of the TOPY network, but also of the psychology of sigillizing TOPY style. Meaning, on the 23rd of each month at 2300 hours, you sigillized in enhancement with your bodily fluids, blood, spit, and sexual fluids, in and or on your own very personal and magical artwork, and then sent that off to a TOPY station for safekeeping and egregore building. And what you got in return was a powerful, magical development in general, and a causal wish fulfillment in particular. This is not only a literally phenomenal example of trust in between individuals, but also the foundation of one of the most unique collections of art in the world. A collection of pure aestheticized desire, if you will. The mechanics of sigillizing, according to its formulator par préférence et excellence, Austin Osman Spare, requires actively forgetting about the sigil or symbol in question, so that it can work its magic in other psychic realms than the very counterproductive and usually self-critical rational one. What better way than to send off your sigil to an archive of like expressions, albeit surely containing different inherent goals? In this zoomed-in perspective, the main thing is to ecstatically express, but to remain unaware of the specific of the recipient's views or feelings. Yet, it is still a two-way communication, simply because the sender is aware that the signal will be received, just not commented upon or valued with any traditional tools. We embrace this womb-like void with respect and wonder instead of forcing us into it in desperation. The TOPY sigillizing system is not emblematic of the classical psychological horror vacui, or as Ovid expressed it, ignoti nulla cupido, no one desires that which he doesn't know, but is rather an active and hopefully arousing challenge to aesthetically express a private desire in total honesty and in a spirit of, pardon the pun, come what may. Perhaps this temporary contact with a void that we usually immediately feel with a need for an acknowledgement from another is actually the key to this magic's efficiency. For Spare, it certainly seemed that way. He recommended immediate post facto forgetfulness of whatever had been strategically constructed before and leading up to the climax of the ritual. We send something out and that's it and that's that. No stopping, no pondering, just moving along and let the psychic powers of your own mind work its magic in the background, in the unconscious, in the subconscious, in the chaosphere, or whatever you want to call it. Sigils weren't only produced in works on paper, as one might perhaps think. Thematically as well as technologically, the use of video and cut-ups was constantly present. Remember that PTV was at this time a video group that also made music. The name Psychick Television is undoubtedly symptomatic, indicating a technology that addresses and can affect the inner spheres of the individual. TOPY, Kalis and Edens were encouraged to actively experiment with making videos and video cut-ups. And at TOPY Scan we certainly did, using everything we had access to, both in terms of connecting to VHS machines for direct editing and quasi-arcane formats like Super 8 in our explorations of both form and content, and to an increasing degree making this art talismanic, charged with will, albeit not necessarily visibly so. The medium was at the time very much the message, to quote Marshall McLuhan. TV was omnipresent and greatly enhanced through technological developments that allowed for cable TV and satellite TV, both of course paving the way for the digital leviathan that would follow throughout the 1990s, the internet. In an interview from 1978 with Throbbing Gristle collaborator and journalist John Savage, another TOPY inspiration, British science fiction author J.G. Ballard, was more prescient than ever when talking about video and its possibly magical use. I quote, "I think the same thing will happen, beginning with people endlessly photographing themselves. Shaving, having dinner together, having domestic rows. Of course, the bedroom applications are obvious, but I think they'll go beyond that, to the point where each of us will be at the center of a sort of non-stop serial with all kinds of possibilities let in. You may be able to splice in bits of Key Largo and Casablanca into the daily record of your life, to the point where you literally do become a character in a bogey movie." End quote. What else was going on at the time in the UK? If we disregard the almost mainstreamed presences stemming from the revived paganism of Murray, Gardner, Sanders and Wicca in general, and Crowley being filtered down through A gradually revived Caliphate OTO, B, a vital Typhonian OTO thanks to its masterful freestyle syncretist Kenneth Grant, and C, the energized enthusiasm of self-defined offspring Amado Crowley and his problematic relationship to his possible father. We find the IoT, or the magical pact of the Illuminates of the Thanateros. The IoT is interesting because it runs parallel in our space and timeline, budding out of London in the late 1970s and properly forming or solidifying throughout the 1980s. The dissemination of their chaos magic through writings like Peter Carroll's Liber Null and Psychonaut created an impact, as well as their fanzine Chaos International, as well as the writings of other members such as Phil Hine, Lionel Snell, Dave Lee, Ray Sherwin, and Frater Ude, Ralph Techtmeyer. A doctrine of pragmatism, anti-authoritarianism, and extreme individualism connected to the very same zeitgeist as TOPY did, with many of the same sources of inspiration. William Burroughs, both in vivo and in his work, would be a great example, and Austin Spare's important work another. The actual acknowledgement of adopted ancestors was a central part of the construction of a discourse. The references in themselves were a core message. In many ways, it was a reconstructed 1980s way of paraphrasing Crowley's Gnostic Mass, in which the included list of Gnostic saints is, I would argue, as important as the ritual's ecstatic Rilio moment and its elementary aftermath. In TOPY, the names of Burroughs, Guysin, Spare, and Brian Jones, to name but a few, were so flaunted consciously that they seeped into the outside culture as much or more as they had seeped into TOPY from the outside via individual inspirations that were shared within the network. TOPY became like a resonance box or an amplifier of chosen memes or spirits, and one that also kept evolving. More towards the end of Phase 1, Timothy Leary, for instance, and many others from the original 1960s psychedelic movement had been integrated and enhanced in the current hyperdelia of PTV and TOPY of the mid to late 1980s. In one of the talismanic reference lists of Jan's books published in Research's special issue called Industrial Culture Handbook, there are many titles by Francis King, who was one of the most thorough British chroniclers of magic during the 20th century. Published in 1971, his wonderful book Sexuality, Magic and Perversion is a useful overview of historical occurrences dealing with sex in magic and magic in sex, and one which Jan had and studied. Crowley is of course prominently featured, but Austin Spare isn't even mentioned, quite strangely. This was, however, only some 15 years after Spare's death, and not much had actually been written about him. His main resurgence came slightly later through the works of Kenneth Grant, whose books were also on Jan's reading list. This led to a new resurgence fueled by name-dropping from both Genesis and many of the people in the England's Hidden Reverse scene. There were also some nice facsimile editions of Spare's works in the 1970s via 93 Publishing, and eventually the bookstore The Sorcerer's Apprentice in Leeds, a hub for all things magical in general and chaos magic in particular. They published a collected works edition in 1982 that was ecstatic and phenomenal fuel for all of us who couldn't afford the original editions at the time. This was also highly symptomatic of the DIY zeitgeist, making something valuable available again in affordable form and promoting it for new audiences, this time enhanced with an introduction by Peter Carroll of the IoT. Today, as we know, basically everything Spare ever wrote is out there in nice editions again, thanks to publishers like Fulgur, including books with his amazing art. Already in his 1971 book, Francis King could envision a future of innovative sexual magic. Quote, "I rather look forward to its occurrence, for, while I have no doubt that such a movement will be inevitably accompanied by the same irritating pretentiousness that characterizes contemporary Zen Buddhism, I am sure that it will enable at least a few people to use sexuality as a means of transcending normal modes of consciousness." End quote. Little did he know that only 10 years later there would actually be a paramilitary occult organization that shared demystified magical techniques in an underground syncretism of 20th century sex magic, individualism, deconstruction, and reconstruction, making hidden or forgotten people, expressions, and myths available, de-occulting it in a way, or occulturating it, and a very active network of free-spirited people through which personal obsessions and kinks could be vented and respected in trust. A collaborative yet individualistic effort at creating art, magic, myth, a new existential language in a way. And to me, it brings to mind Nietzsche talking about the power of art and myth as it, quote, constantly confuses the cells and the classification of concepts by setting up new translations, metaphors, metonyms. It constantly manifests the desire to shape the given world of the waking human being in ways which are just as multiform, irregular, inconsequential, incoherent, charming, and ever new as things are in the world of dreams. End quote. In the anarchic but not necessarily anarchistic attitudes of TOPY, we find a healthy worldview. The world or the system or even big bad control itself is perhaps, and after all, not necessarily there to be toppled over and torn down in overheated reactivity, but rather to be critically looked at from different perspectives so that a more constructive side and agenda can be made visible. In this we see kinship with many things that were going on at the time. A postmodern discourse, deconstruction, and quantum physics, to mention but a few, meaning a new and critical approach to accepted givens within many fields that may no longer be the best and most useful. In this ambitious DIY case, a deconstructing of magic and culture within a larger context of human individual life in a society that seems designed solely to subjugate, and then reconstructing the splinters or blocks into a vibrant and vital occulture that is open-minded, proactive, and life-enhancing. To deconstruct in order to reconstruct, and not as a mind and pointless, whimsical academic pastime. Thank you for listening to this lecture. If you would like to support my work, please check out all my books, and please also consider supporting the Patreon I have together with my wife, artist and psychoanalyst Vanessa Sinclair, at patreon.com/Vanessa23Carl. There are also many relevant links in the information text about this lecture. Again, many thanks for being here, and I hope to see you soon again.